You've clicked on my face again. That means one of two things. You just want to hear me talk, or you want to hear me gush about Star Trek-ish things. Both are fine. And as the title of this video implies, the title, I don't even know what I'm going to call it. It's not a review, really. I'll figure it out later, but yes, I finally watched the Orville. And for some of you who don't know, Star Trek The Next Generation, it's one of my favorite shows of all time. I think it's one of the greatest shows ever made. It's one of those shows I like to have on, running in my house, even if I'm not focused in and watching it, because I like the ambient noise it brings. By noise, I mean art. Next Generation is timeless, it's profound, it's thought-provoking, it's fantastic. So I heard about this show, The Orville. I guess it started 5 years ago now, time does fly, but I just heard about it. It was like, oh, Seth MacFarlane, it's kind of a love letter to Star Trek. I was like, all right, Family Guy in space, but love letter to Star Trek. So the story is, I have a friend who texted me one day, it was about a month ago, and he was like, have you seen The Orville? I know you love Star Trek. I think you would like this. I was like, oh, Family Guy in space? He was like, it's not totally like that. And it does, you feel the Star Trek love there. I think you would like it. I was like, okay, finish the show and then let me know what you think, and by the end, and maybe I'll watch it. Then shortly after that, I found out that Brannon Braga is involved with the Orville. That's when production, knowing the production side of it, it's very helpful. Brannon Braga, producer and writer on Star Trek The Next Generation, also worked on Voyager and Enterprise. And that's when it changed. You know, hearing my friend go, hey, I know you would like this show, that got my curiosity, but Brannon Braga got my attention. That's when my perception of the Orville changed entirely. It went from Seth MacFarlane does a love letter to Star Trek to this creative team wants to bring Star Trek back and keep it alive because New Trek doesn't really feel like Star Trek. That's when I was like, all right, all things considered, clocking in, let's go. And season one, like if you have that old guy, maybe it's your dad, maybe it's your grandfather, and they love Star Trek, and you want a new show to show them Star Trek, season one's gonna be tough because it does have a lot of that, I would call it Seth MacFarlane humor.
Back at Union Point, we called that a glory hole.
You called it a glory hole. Nobody else called it a glory hole.
Now entering glory hole.
No, Bortus, it's not, it's...
Sir?
It's fine.
Right, there's a lot of that situational circumstance, that humor that is driving the show in season one. I would call season one a comedy. Some have called it a parody. It does ride that line. However, even in that, you do see the Trek love. There are some episodes where you're like, this definitely does feel like Star Trek. There's actually an episode in here where it's like, that is straight up Black Mirror. And it's about social media. There are actually situations where I'm like, I've seen that in Star Trek before, actually. You're doing something that Star Trek has done. But, you know, it's been decades since Star Trek, so our understanding of the universe, that's been expanded. Maybe they can play a little bit with that. Our social constructs are a little different, so it's kind of fun to see something revisited that I recognize the theme of it from Star Trek The Next Generation, but it doesn't play out exactly the same. Season 2, I feel like, was when they were like, okay, we are the Star Trek love letter, and that's our strength. You know, it's not the humor. It's not this being a comedy. The Star Trek love is the strength of the show. The humor got pushed back a bit. The Star Trek got pushed to the front, and that's when it shined a bit more. Not that the humor's not in it. It definitely still had that humor. I thought season 2 was a great balance of humor in Star Trek, to be honest with you. To the point where it kind of scratched that Firefly itch for me, you know, where it's like, it's a comedy when it needs to be, it gets serious when it needs to be. Also, season 2 is when the show gets epic, like it actually grows in scale to the point where they run into this situation, you're like, oh, that's gonna be a thing. Kind of like the Dominion War in Deep Space Nine, where you're like, okay, we have the show and we're also dealing with that. Only instead of being stuck on a space station the entire time, you do still have that space exploration going on while this situation's going down. Season 3 is called New Horizons for no reason other than the fact that it's now on Hulu. But man, you do see it. You see the fact that they got some of that fuck you Hulu money. It kind of reminded me, again, to reference Firefly, it reminded me if you're watching Firefly, then you watch Serenity and you're like, oh yeah, it's that universe, but with a bigger budget. You just see it in the production of the show, but that's when they were like, okay, we're pulling back the comedy a lot more, filtering it through a couple of characters, namely Gordon and Bortus. He's the pilot, kind of does remind me of Wash, another Firefly reference. You know, the funny pilot, that's totally him. Bortus is kind of like Drax, you know, he's very emotionless, but the things he says it's funny. That's what makes it funny.
I will be sure to bring my, what does Lieutenant Malloy call it? My A-game.
There you go, buddy.
But I do feel bad for the cast in season 3 at a point, because season 3 was when it was like, okay, we're going to stop making so many jokes, going to filter most of the comedy through a couple of characters, which means Seth MacFarlane, you're now the captain. So a lot of times he's standing there all stern, kind of cocks his head, and raises an eyebrow while he's listening. You feel it most with Seth MacFarlane, but you can tell the entire crew. I mean, that's got to be tough, right? You sign on for this comedy, and now they're like, nope, less comedy, more Star Trek. Probably tough to roll with. But I felt season 3 still had those gem episodes that really shine through. One with Gordon, I thought was incredible. Guys, in the end, I just wanted to give this show love. I feel like it deserves love. It's moving to Disney Plus in a few days. It's on Hulu right now, both owned by Disney, so they're getting their money either way. How I've gone on about it being a great Star Trek love letter in its own right. It's a great show that stands on its own two legs. The adventures are great and thought-provoking in their own right. Added bonuses, it reminds me of something Star Trek used to do. I'm invested in the crew. I like their characters. I have my favorites, of course. I'm invested in their relationships among each other. You know, it's a show that has gripped me as its own show. Also love to the late, great Norm Macdonald. He plays a character, or he voices a character in here. And there's some Star Trek alums that make some appearances. Some actors that you may recognize from other Star Trek shows, some of the old Star Trek shows, Next Generation, Voyager, Enterprise. They make some guest appearances in here. I mean, they're probably actors taking on roles for the reason most actors take on roles, for the paycheck. But there's a part of me that would just love to think that it's because the actors are like, oh, I see what this show's doing. Right on, stamp of approval. I get it, there are a lot of shows out there, only so many hours in a day or a week. I get how it is. But if you are a Star Trek fan out there, and new Star Trek just isn't doing it for you, and you feel like something's lost, like you did what I did, and you kind of resigned yourself to the fact of, all right, Star Trek as it was is just a thing of the past. We're not gonna see it anymore. If you're looking for my recommendation, the Orville has it. And when I say the Orville's the best Star Trek out right now, I don't mean the Orville compared to all Star Trek that has ever been in the history of Star Trek. No. What I mean is, among new Star Trek shows that have come out recently and are coming out still, the show that I feel captures the spirit of Star Trek the most is the show that's not technically Star Trek. And that is just what I wanted to talk with you about. All right, so the Orville, have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever you thought, comment below, let me know. And as always, if you like what you've seen here and you want to see more, click right here to see more.